August 2nd, 1943. Near the motor pool, a man was adjusting his cap, his eyes glancing towards the watchtower. Not far away, another man was tightening his grip on the gun in his hand. Everyone seemed to be waiting for a signal. No one knew that this was the beginning of an uprising, a revolt by the prisoners at the Treblinka extermination camp. In just a few more seconds, this place would be nothing but a pile of ashes. So how did the people who were brought here to die set the entire death camp on fire? What made them choose to rise up right here in what was considered humanity's killing machine? Treblinka wasn't an ordinary concentration camp. It was one of the most dangerous places in Nazi-occupied Europe, built during Operation Reinhardt with a single purpose: to wipe out the entire Jewish community in Poland. This place wasn't a labor camp. It wasn't a prison. It was a true slaughterhouse. Trains carrying Jews from Bialystok, Warsaw, and other parts of Europe arrived one after another. They were herded down from cattle cars, pushed through the camp gates, and a few hours later, disappeared into the gas chambers camouflaged behind fences and trees. In just over a year, nearly 800,000 Jews, including men, women, children, and infants, were murdered with poison gas. The killing machine ran at full capacity, sometimes reaching 20,000 people a day. By mid-1943, almost all the Jews in Poland had been murdered. As new forced labor programs began to take priority, the Nazis also decided to consolidate the industrial killing machine at Auschwitz to Birkenau. That meant one cold, hard fact: Treblinka was about to be shut down. The barracks would be destroyed, and the ground would be plowed over to create a fake farm to hide the horrific crimes committed here. About 870 Jewish prisoners were still kept alive, not out of mercy, but to carry out the final stages of this death camp's operation. And they all understood one thing that few dared to say out loud. When this work was finished, they would disappear too. As the end drew near, they had every reason to fear they would be the last victims to die in Treblinka's gas chambers. That realization awakened something that fear had long buried within them: the will to resist. A small group began to act in secret. The leader was Zev Kurland, an older prisoner who had enough credibility to connect many groups. Joining him were people from different backgrounds: Zelo Bloch, a Czech army officer; Adolf Friedman, a veteran who had served in the French Foreign Legion. They organized an uprising. Their first efforts were to bribe the non-German auxiliary guards with money and gold taken from the victims' luggage during previous failed revolts. If enough people could be bought, they could seize the armory and escape. But the plan was discovered when their accomplice, the Jewish doctor in charge of the camp's infirmary, Julian Korazicki, was caught in the act of bribery. He knew that under torture, he would likely reveal his comrades. So before he could be interrogated, he took poison to kill himself. His death sent a shockwave through the camp. It seemed like everything was over, but the remaining members soon rallied their spirits. His death only reinforced one thing: they had nothing left to lose. The uprising plan continued to be developed, with the participation of prisoners in key roles. Among them were Alfred Galewski, a veteran engineer in the camp; Rudolf Masarek, a Christian lieutenant in the Czech army with extensive military experience; and especially the carpenter Jankel Wiernik, who was brought to Treblinka during the Great Action, Grosse Action, in the Warsaw Ghetto in August 1942. In this death camp, his profession meant he had to build and repair the very structures that served the killing machine. Because of this, he was very familiar with the camp's construction and operational structure, which was mostly made of wood. So Wiernik became a crucial link in this uprising plan. They began to organize into small cells, usually of 5 people, each assigned a specific task: breaking into the armory, setting fire to the barracks, attacking the guards, destroying the fences, and providing cover for the prisoners' escape. They met at night in the dark corners of the workshops, using the sounds of hammers and machinery to conceal their conversations. For months, they gathered every piece of information. Which patrols were delayed? How long did it take for the alarm to respond when activated? Everything necessary was being carefully prepared. Together, they did the impossible. Their plan was designed like a military operation. They successfully infiltrated the camp's armory, thanks to prisoners from the metal workshop who secretly copied the armory key using melted scrap metal and a wax mold. They practiced until the copy was a perfect fit. Over several weeks, weapons were stolen in small numbers. A few pistols, some rifles, a few grenades. Every move was carefully calculated. Every day was an ordeal. A small mistake, a wrong look could ruin everything. But discipline held firm. No fear, no rush, no noise. The prisoners constantly reminded themselves that their goal was not just to escape, but to leave a legacy. If they were to die, they would die as human beings, not as shadows. The prisoners were living almost two lives at once. By day, they were the obedient forced laborers in the eyes of the guards. But at night, they became the ones quietly preparing for a life or death resistance. In the metal workshop, the clanging of tools masked the secret work. Under the sound of hammers and locomotives, they melted scrap iron into crude bullets, repaired stolen shell casings, and tested small parts of rifles in the noise of the trains so no one would notice. Just one spark in the wrong place, one gunshot too soon, and the entire plan would collapse instantly. Every morning, the camp operated as usual. Roll call, forced labor, sorting the belongings of those just killed. But for those in the conspiracy, every daily task now had another purpose. They secretly measured the distance between guard posts, memorized the guards' shift schedules, and even calculated the wind direction so the smoke from the eventual fires could conceal their movements. Every detail was prepared in silence. When to cut the telephone lines, when to open the armory, when to light the fuel depot. Shorthand signals replaced words. And in the darkness of Treblinka, an uprising was being assembled like a desperate but chillingly precise machine. By the end of July, they saw signs that the SS were preparing to dismantle the camp. Trenches were being filled, documents destroyed. The prisoners understood what that meant. They were no longer needed. Their value was gone. And so the plan that had only existed in whispers and shadows finally took shape in fire and determination. The men of Treblinka sped up the timeline for the uprising. They would strike first to burn the camp, to scatter its ashes, and to remind the world that even in a place built to silence them, resistance could still speak. On August 2nd, at 2:30 p.m., the moment had finally come. It was a hot summer day, and the camp commandant Franz Stangl, 4 SS soldiers, and 16 foreign volunteer guards had gone for a swim in the nearby Bug River. After the lunch break, the teams began to prepare in silence. A prisoner, Rudek Lubrinsky, who was in charge of repairing the SS motor vehicles, sabotaged the engine of an armored car, while others distributed wire cutters and axes they had taken from the repair shop. Meanwhile, another group of prisoners, tasked with spraying disinfectant in the barracks, went about their usual work. But today, their tanks were filled with gasoline. Until 3:30 p.m., the plan was running exactly as the prisoners had prepared. But then, an unexpected incident occurred. An SS officer, Oberscharführer Kuttner, was seen talking to a known informant. This was extremely dangerous, because in a camp like Treblinka, a single accusation was enough to expose the entire network. Tension rose even further when Kuttner saw a young Jewish man carrying a large amount of money, something completely unusual in that situation, which could make him suspect an escape was being planned. For Galevsky, it was a sign that the plan might have been discovered. If they waited for the scheduled time, they risked the SS striking first, disarming them and killing all participants. So, he was forced to make an extremely risky decision. He sent a man to shoot Kuttner and launched the uprising 30 minutes early. At 4 p.m., the peaceful rhythm of Treblinka was shattered. A gunshot rang out. Kuttner fell. The signal was understood clearly. The prisoners immediately took action, attacking their predetermined targets. An explosion was heard near the engine depot, followed by the roar of flames. Just seconds later, another explosion tore through the armory, where fuel barrels ignited fiercely. Stolen rifles were passed from hand to hand. Grenades hidden in buckets and baskets were thrown towards the guard posts. Fire leaped from one shed to another, spreading with terrifying speed, sending columns of smoke soaring into the sky. Lubrinsky set the fuel depot on fire, but also lost his life in the process. Others threw grenades at the headquarters and stormed the watchtowers. Many others joined in, armed with whatever they could find, shovels, pickaxes, and guns from the armory. And together, they charged the guards and broke through the fences. The guards' screams were swallowed by the inferno. The fire swept through the fuel depot, along the barrack roofs, the black columns of smoke acting as an undeniable alarm. Prisoners poured out from the workshops and barracks. The camp siren blared, summoning guards from every corner. On the watchtowers, machine guns immediately opened fire. Bursts of bullets cut through the air, whistling coldly as they raked the camp yard. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, fire, and human breath. Many prisoners fell right where they stood, their bodies collapsing to the ground. Others kept running, driven by something deeper than hope. They didn't hesitate, refused to stop. They stepped over the bodies, running and screaming, their bare hands grabbing wire cutters, wood, scrap iron, anything that could clear a path. A grenade thrown near the kitchen exploded, killing both guards and prisoners, shattering glass and sending shards flying through the air. The explosion ignited nearby fuel barrels, and the fire began to spread toward the workshops containing ammunition. Subsequent explosions rang out in steady waves, echoing like distant thunder across the fields. Some wounded prisoners turned back to help others, dragging the injured through the smoke. They knew what it meant. To slow down meant death, but they did it anyway. Even amid the horror, compassion was present. Near the main gate, a group of prisoners armed with crowbars and iron bars was trying to pry the gate open. Barbed wire was ripped away. Fence posts shook. And in that moment of chaos, the boundaries that had been built to imprison people began to be broken by human strength itself. The hinges creaked and bent, but held firm under the weight of the steel. Together, they rammed the gate. Once, twice, then a third time. The gate burst open, and at the same time, a volley of gunfire tore through the ranks. Several fell instantly. The prisoners began to scatter. Some reached the outer edge, where a minefield was waiting. Explosions ripped through the ground as they crossed, smoke billowing around them. The minefield outside the fence also claimed many lives, but they kept running. The remaining prisoners ran towards the Bug River. For many, it symbolized freedom, but guards on the other side were waiting. Bullets slapped into the water. Some prisoners waded in, others jumped, trying to swim across the current. A few made it, but most did not. The river became a mirror of sacrifice, carrying bodies and tattered uniforms downstream. As the sun set, Treblinka was unrecognizable. Fires burned fiercely in the barracks, smoke covered the horizon, and the sound of gunfire gradually faded. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, ash, and mud. Bodies were scattered across the yard, both prisoners and guards, their faces illuminated by the last embers of the burning wood. The uprising had failed in terms of coordination, but was a victory in spirit. Against all rules, all weapons, and all calculations, it still happened. The impossible had occurred inside the most tightly controlled place on Earth, and somewhere outside the fences, under a fiery sky. A few figures were still stumbling through the darkness, exhausted, wounded, but still alive. Every step they took carried the story of Treblinka out of the fire, to a world that would one day listen. The barracks collapsed one by one. The armory exploded with a deafening blast, sending debris flying across the yard. The sky, once gray with the smoke of victims, now carried the fire of resistance. The uprising lasted less than an hour, but it changed everything. Where silence and submission had reigned, there was now chaos. The SS scrambled to regain control, their orders echoing in the roar of the flames. Dogs barked frantically, their commands drowned out by the explosions and the terrifying screams of the wounded. Groups of prisoners broke through the fences and fled towards the forest, their bare feet scratched by thorns and barbed wire. Some stepped on mines, others disappeared into the thick smoke. Behind them, the towers continued to fire, cutting down those too slow or too weak to escape. Yet, even those who fell had broken the camp's unwritten rule that no one resists. The SS began to shoot anyone they found alive. The fire burned through the night, consuming the barracks, workshops, and archive offices. What was once the most efficient killing center in occupied Poland was now nothing but a pile of ashes. About 700 prisoners participated in the uprising. Nearly half were cut down by machine guns and landmines, including Bloch, Friedman, Galewski, and Masaryk. 300 who escaped were later recaptured or turned in by Poles with anti-Semitic views. But more than 100 managed to escape successfully, and many of them were hidden and saved by sympathetic Poles. A group of escapees reached the edge of the forest, about 12 kilometers from the camp, and stayed there all day. They hid in the bushes, occasionally hearing distant screams. It must have been the screams of Jews captured by the Germans. The day passed, and when night fell, they moved on again. After several days of walking, they passed through Siedlce and finally reached Warsaw. Many of the escapees would join the resistance or partisan forces and continue to fight. When the war ended, about 70 of them were still alive. In the camp, Kuttner was wounded but survived, and though the exact number is unknown, at least half of the guards were killed. When Camp Commandant Stangl returned to the burning camp, he ordered the execution of all surviving or captured prisoners, leaving only the 100 weakest to work until the camp's closure at the end of the month, a few weeks earlier than planned. The uprising had sent a message that, even in the most desperate of places, resistance was possible. As dawn broke, smoke still rose from the ruins. The silence that followed was not the silence of failure, but the silence of consequence, the stillness that comes after an act too terrible to measure. Treblinka, the camp built for destruction, was forced to witness its own downfall. Victory was not in the numbers, but in the meaning. In that hour of terror and fire, a few hundred prisoners did what no army could do. They shattered the illusion of Nazi invincibility. The legacy of the uprising is not measured by survival, but by memory. Proof that even in the darkest system ever created, human courage can burn brighter than fear. After the catastrophe and in the context of history, the fires of Treblinka had died down, but the echo of the uprising did not fade. What began as a desperate attempt to survive became one of the most powerful acts of human resistance in history. It was a moment that proved resistance could exist, even in a place designed to completely destroy it. The SS, furious and humiliated, returned to find their most secret mass murder site covered in ashes. For days, they scoured the surrounding countryside, hunting for the escapees. Armed patrols and dogs searched the forests, executing anyone suspected of helping the fugitives. Yet, even in this brutal retaliation, the uprising had achieved the impossible. It had stopped the killing machine. The camp never became fully operational again, determined to erase all traces of what had happened. The Nazis dismantled Treblinka piece by piece. The camp would then be hidden as planned, as would the uprising of August 2nd. By then, Treblinka had become so deadly that the escaped prisoners were not only the sole survivors of that day's events, but also the only people deported to Treblinka who lived to tell the story and preserve the memory of those who fell. Without the survivors of the uprising, Treblinka might have remained in history as just a huge number of deaths. The victims here would have been just names on a list and statistics in the Nazi killing machine. But thanks to the brave men of that day, they are an army of the dead, who inspired the struggle for freedom under nearly hopeless conditions. Thus, the details of the final suffering of nearly 1 million innocent people remain. as a cautionary tale against the hatred that killed them. Never forget, if you're still watching, it means history matters to you. Subscribe to see more historical stories about escapes on the channel.